And I spoke to people who had survived massacres of entire towns, who had seen their family members raped, tortured, killed.
Maria McFarland Sánchez-Moreno is the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, which she joined last September after over a decade as a drug policy analyst at Human Rights Watch. She's also the author of There Are No Dead Here, a story of murder and denial in Colombia. Her book chronicles that country's bloody history after the death of cocaine trafficker Pablo Escobar and the conflicts among Colombia's military, surviving drug lords, left-wing terrorists known as the FARC, paramilitary groups, and civil rights activists. The book is also a critique of how the United States inserted itself into Colombia's struggles in the name of our own war on drugs. I talked to McFarland recently at Reason's New York studio. Maria, thanks for talking to Reason.
Thanks so much for having me.
There Are No Dead Here is disturbing, arresting, riveting. Summarize the kind of plot line that you're telling and why it's important that people in America know about it.
So the book starts in the late 90s when paramilitary groups were rapidly expanding all over the country. These were right-wing death squads that in theory were fighting the left-wing guerrillas of the FARC. The reality is that they were also the country's biggest drug traffickers. They had picked up the reins of where Pablo Escobar had, and the Cali cartel had left off, and many of them were former Escobar associates, in fact. People who are familiar with narcos or might know the story of the Pepes who helped to kill Pablo Escobar. Well, the paramilitaries are descendants of that. Right. The U.S. At the time was pouring billions of dollars into fighting a war on drugs in Colombia. And in many cases, that money was going to the military. And the military was working very, very closely with paramilitary groups. So ultimately, what the U.S. was doing in practice was pouring money into one side, one group of drug traffickers versus another group.
And, you know, this obviously in many ways is an echo of American kind of intervention in the 1980s, a little bit further up in Central America or Latin America. What was the United States trying to gain by giving money to the military and effectively the paramilitaries?
Well, the vast increase in funding came with Plan Colombia. And the idea was there to supposedly help Colombia fight drug trafficking and secure peace. And in theory, they said that they were fighting all drug traffickers. And in some cases, the U.S. was working with members of the Colombian government against paramilitary groups. At one point, they even went so far as to declare the paramilitaries a foreign terrorist organization alongside the FARC. And there were efforts to extradite some of their leaders. But in practice, it was very clear that there were Colombian military units who were working with the paramilitaries. The U.S. knew that because groups like Human Rights Watch, where I used to work, were telling the U.S. this. It was very clear. And they were just turning a blind eye to that in many cases because, frankly, I don't know. They were very committed to this policy. They were very committed to certain political leaders in Colombia. And I think it just became too difficult to deal with the implications of what was happening there.
And I mean, part of it, I guess, was with Plan Colombia, and this was a Clinton era or a Bill Clinton administration initiative that was widely supported by everybody. And then it moved into the Bush era as well. But the idea that Colombia, and particularly under Escobar, it was something like 80% or more of the cocaine that was coming into America, he was bringing directly. So if we fix Colombia, then we fix America's cocaine problem.
Right. I mean, the whole premise of the war on drugs has always been that if you focus on the supply side, then you'll solve all the U.S.'s problems with problematic drug use, and that's simply not true. We've been dealing with the war on drugs for, 6 decades now? And drug use fluctuates, but it's never really gone down significantly.
And certainly the attempt to kind of tighten down or nail down the supply, deplete it, never seems to work, or it doesn't show up in the price on the street of anything. So how, the idea being that if we were able to stop cocaine production in Colombia, the price in the U.S. would go up, the street price, and fewer people would use it, or at least we would know that interdiction was working. Are there ways in which, and before we talk about the effects in Colombia, which is really the heart of the book, and like I said, I mean, it's horrifying and impossible to turn away from. What is your kind of evaluation of Plan Colombia? Was it a complete failure? Is it a partial failure? What comes out of that?
Well, Plan Colombia was overwhelmingly about military assistance. Portions of it went to the justice sector, or social and economic assistance. And I would say that those pieces are important to maintain, because you're talking about a country that doesn't have the capacity to hold people accountable when they commit crimes. I mean, this is one reason you have massive atrocities and everyone gets away with everything. On the other hand, I think that to some extent, all of this money is going to waste as long as you don't deal with the underlying problem of the illicit market in drugs, which is fueling organized crime on a massive scale. I mean, there are so many profits that can be obtained from that market that no matter how much money you put into fighting organized crime, there are always going to be new leaders who step into the shoes of those who've been arrested, and it's just going to continue. So, I mean, ultimately then, and we'll talk about this when we talk about your relatively recent role, a new role at Drug Policy Alliance, but I mean, until we get rid of a kind of prohibitionist mindset, we might be able to stop particular drug flows or kill particular drug lords, but the larger problem cannot be solved. Pretty much, yeah. So in terms of Colombia, I mean, you focus on a number of figures who are pretty heroic. Talk about, one or two of those and why you focus on them, and what are the lessons that we can learn from, in many cases, their tragic ends. Yeah, so the first main character is a man called Jesus Maria Valle, who in the late 90s was a human rights activist in Medellin and in Antioquia generally. He was from a rural area near Medellin, and he started hearing reports from the people in his home region about paramilitaries going in there and killing people, ordinary people, accusing them of being FARC guerrillas, and trying to take over control of the area. He also started hearing that they were working closely with members of the military. So he began speaking out when nobody else was doing so. And he would go to the governor, he would go to the head of the army in Antioquia, the region. He spoke on TV, he wrote articles, gave speeches, and repeatedly got shut down. People ignored him. People said it's not true. At one point, the army sued him for defamation. The governor, who later became president, Álvaro Uribe, allegedly said that he was an enemy of the armed forces because of the things he was saying. So Valle was left alone with these allegations. And there was a horrifying massacre that happened in 1997 in October called the Massacre of El Aro, in which paramilitaries went into a town, killed 17 people, including children, tortured. It was vicious, and then drove everybody else out of the town. Valle had warned that something was going to happen. He tried to get help, and then later he repeatedly said, the military was involved in this, I have evidence. A few months later, he was killed in his office in Medellin. And the case was essentially buried. Nobody really got to investigate in depth. Some people tried early on, but they didn't find the killers until much later. And only in the last month or so, we've been hearing some new information coming out about who was behind his death. And my book includes a fair amount of information about that as well. But the thing is, Valle inspired other people. And he showed how important it was to tell the truth. And other people then picked up where he left off. And one of those other people was Ivan Velázquez, a friend of his who was chief prosecutor for Antioquia at the time. He tried to conduct investigations of the paramilitaries, and 11 of his investigators in the course of 1 year got killed for those investigations. They, at one point, found all of the accounting records of the paramilitaries. They started tracing those records to prominent people in the region. And that investigation got shut down, apparently by more senior people in the Attorney General's office. And after the investigators were killed, Ivan said he was asked to resign, and that ended. But years later, he ended up on the Supreme Court of Colombia, and he led what became known as the parapolitics investigations, where he documented links between the Colombian Congress and paramilitary groups and showed how paramilitaries had helped members of Congress engage in electoral fraud. And a third of the Colombian Congress ended up investigated, and many of them in prison for working with paramilitaries. And that in turn led to, in conjunction with other efforts, a situation where suddenly a lot of the truth about the paramilitaries was coming out. And even though Colombia still has serious problems and descendants of paramilitaries are still out there committing crimes, I think it could be much, much worse if all of that hadn't come out. So there are good lessons. It's terrible that people had to die to get to this point, but it's also true that even in the darkest of times, if you stand up for principle, as these people did, you can prevail.
Right. And you're cautiously optimistic. I mean, Colombia has negotiated what seems to be a decent peace accord with the FARC. So, I mean, how, are you optimistic, or how optimistic, how cautious are you about optimism for Colombia?
I think it's complex for the same reason I was mentioning before about organized crime. They do have a peace deal with the FARC, and it may well be that actor in the conflict, or much of it, does disappear, does enter the political system. And as Ivan, one of the characters, notes, that might help to take away one of the excuses that paramilitaries and other people on the right have had for persecuting people on the left, and killing them and so on. However, I think that as long as you have the illicit drug market, you're going to have actors out there who want to control territory. And we're already seeing examples of armed groups going into areas that the FARC left and taking over control, because the state doesn't have the capacity to protect or control those areas. And frankly, with so much money, they can just corrupt police and military officers, and it becomes very difficult to resist efforts by armed groups to go in.
What is your take on Donald Trump has been president for a year? If nothing else, he hasn't articulated a lot of clear policies on a lot of things. He seems to be very personally anti-drug. How is that affecting foreign policy in the Trump administration, and particularly Latin America?
Well, at least when it comes to Colombia, I think people have been pretty shocked by the way Trump has treated the country, because here's a country that has suffered devastating losses in the name of the war on drugs. And throughout Plan Colombia, the government at least was always trying to portray itself as the U.S.'s best partner in Latin America. And suddenly Trump comes out and says, I'm going to decertify you as a partner in the war on drugs, simply because they started trying to do things a little differently. The background to this is that in the last couple of years, Colombia said they were going to stop aerial fumigation of coca crops. And there has been an increase in coca cultivation. There also, is this deal with the FARC, and Trump doesn't seem to look upon it very favorably. So that might be what's driving Trump. I don't think he articulated it in a great deal of detail, but I think it did come as a shock to Colombians. And, I think for Latin America experts, it's kind of surprising also, given how close the U.S. and Colombia have been in the past.
Let's talk about the Drug Policy Alliance. What are your priorities as executive director? And you became executive director last August, right?
September.
Or September.
Yeah.
Okay. So.
Yeah. So I think we have to focus on three things right now. One, obviously, we have to look at overdose. This has been a priority for for Drug Policy Alliance for a long time. We've been pioneers working on overdose and pushing for harm reduction solutions. In other words, measures that recognize that some people are going to use drugs problematically and that we should try to reduce the harms associated with that, as well as reduce the harms associated with criminalization. And so we've been pushing very hard for measures like supervised consumption sites, where people who are going to use drugs anyway, can use them under the supervision of trained professionals who can monitor them for overdose, stop the overdose if necessary, and provide referrals for other services or treatment if that's what they want. We've been pushing for access to naloxone, the overdose reversal medication, not only in the hands of first responders, but also in the hands of people in the community, people who are closest to those who are likely to overdose.
That seems to be gaining a fair amount of acceptance, if not quite popularity, both among law enforcement and first responders and people at large, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Naloxone has gained a great deal of traction. 911 Good Samaritan laws also have been gaining a lot of traction, and we've been working on those for a while. But we do want to see more of a move on supervised consumption sites and on complete packages of harm reduction, and also against state measures that undermine those moves. For example, we've documented recently how many prosecutors in states that have been very hard hit by the overdose crisis are pressing drug-induced homicide charges. So charges against people who share drugs with a friend or maybe sell some small amount, who are often people who use drugs themselves, charging them with murder when there's an overdose, which doesn't solve anything. It's not been shown to have any deterrent effect. It just locks somebody up for decades when that's a person who themselves has problems. And it makes it less likely that people will call 911 because they don't want to be prosecuted. So it undermines the effects of the 911 Good Samaritan laws. But so that's one piece of it. And it's also responding to Trump and Sessions because their approach is very much, at least if you go by their rhetoric, very much an old school, let's double down on the war on drugs, let's go after dealers. And that's what got us here in the first place. The fact that people are afraid of talking about their personal drug use, of seeking help, that there is no help because there's been no investment in that kind of assistance in so many places, means that people are going to be underground and are much more likely to overdose.
Now, on the one hand, you have the opioid crisis, and whether it's cheap heroin or pharmaceuticals that are being used in various ways. You have that going on, and it seems to be intensifying. On the other hand, we have throughout the country a growing acceptance of marijuana legalization and a de-escalation or a demobilization of the war on drugs. What's going on there, and how is DPA working to kind of further the positive? I don't want to say the positive side of the war on drugs, but the places where the war on drugs is kind of the drug warriors are declaring an honorable peace and trying to get the hell out.
Well, I wouldn't say the drug warriors are declaring an honorable peace on marijuana.
Well, even with Trump, it's interesting. When he was a candidate, he said that pot legalization should be handled at the state level. Obviously, Jeff Sessions has said something recently that it's like, I don't care about that. I want federal prosecutors to enforce federal laws. It remains to be seen where that's going on, but certainly Gallup has polls out showing something like 61%, including 50% of Republicans now believe that essentially pot should be treated like beer, wine, and alcohol. So something is changing, right?
Oh, public opinion has changed dramatically on marijuana, and definitely a substantial majority of the country is in favor of legalizing marijuana for adult use. And I think we're going to keep seeing progress on that front, even though Jeff Sessions is clearly trying to stop that. And I would not be surprised if U.S. attorneys, emboldened by Sessions, did try to prosecute, some easy target in some of the states that have legalized. I would not underestimate the aggressiveness in the Department of Justice now. But I don't think they're going to stop the progress. And that's why you saw suddenly, even after Sessions' rescission of the Cold Memo, you saw Vermont come out and legalize. And you're going to keep seeing other states legalize medical marijuana and legalize marijuana itself. Now, beyond that, we're trying to do two things. One is make sure that marijuana legalization is done more the way it was done in California. So with provisions, for example, for record expungement, to right the wrongs of the war on drugs, to make sure that the communities that have been most affected by marijuana prohibition also have access to the market and are not just excluded by, the big companies that come in.
That would be a horrible thing, isn't it? During prohibition periods, you focus a lot of the violence and a lot of the activity in poor neighborhoods or inner city neighborhoods, and then when it becomes legal, you kind of cut them out of the possible profits.
Right. So many people, look, white and black and brown people all use drugs at exactly the same rates. That's including marijuana. And yet, black and brown people are arrested at many times the rate of white people. And that's a reflection of where police have put their resources. They've targeted certain communities. And it's great if you can decriminalize marijuana or legalize marijuana and no longer enforce in those states. But then you need to fix all of those records of people who are now walking around with convictions and can't get jobs, can't get housing, have a series of problems because of those records. And you have to give them access to the market to start making amends for all of the wrongs that were done. The other issue here that we need to look at is how to protect the states where marijuana is legal from the federal government. And you already have the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, which is attached to spending bills, and we have to reattach it to every new spending bill to protect states where there's medical marijuana. So it bars the Justice Department from using federal money to go after medical marijuana in those states. What we'd like to see is something like the McLintock Amendment that's been proposed in the past, which would apply that to states where adult use is legal as well.
Which is also kind of comforting. I mean, Rohrabacher, McLintock, these are kind of right-wing, libertarian, conservative Republicans who are at the forefront of this, which shows, some like a new consensus.
Well, this is not a partisan issue, and marijuana is certainly not a partisan issue. Now, I think that the other thing we need to be looking at is decriminalization of personal use of all drugs. I think that there's an opening now, both because of marijuana legalization, but also because of what people are seeing with the overdose crisis.
Explain, I understand it, but I want to make sure that, our audience does, and that I fully do, the difference between decriminalization and legalization in this context for all drugs.
So when you're talking about decriminalizing, you're just talking about personal use and possession. So you're saying that people who have drugs for personal use,
which is typically defined as not having too many drugs, right? So it's a personal stash.
You can define it by different standards, by looking at intent. For some people set threshold limits. There are different ways of defining it, but basically, people who have drugs for personal use should not be arrested for possessing or using those drugs. You shouldn't be facing a loss of your liberty simply for your personal choices about what you choose to consume, as long as you're not harming somebody else. If you harm somebody else, if you neglect your children, if you commit a crime, a different crime under the influence, and harm others, then it might be legitimate to criminalize. But simply because you possess drugs for personal use, you shouldn't be facing prison. And the data is incredible. Possession for personal use is the single most arrested offense in the country. We're talking about 1.25 million arrests for simple drug possession every year. That's hundreds of thousands of people in prison.
That's millions, more than
over
a million
time,
people.
But on any given day, 135,000 are behind bars for that.
And you think, I was going to ask, what are the lessons from the, increasingly successful campaign to kind of normalize and legalize marijuana use? This is one of the lessons that can be learned, is that if you start with decriminalization of certain types of drugs, people will understand that this isn't going to lead to massive amounts of use, but it will minimize a lot of the harms that are associated with drug prohibition.
Yeah, it's different from marijuana legalization, where in marijuana legalization, you're talking about legalizing the distribution, the sales, the production, all of that. It's a much bigger step. And I don't think the U.S. is in a place yet where you're going to see any state go in that direction with other drugs. But I think decriminalizing personal use could do a tremendous amount of good. It could mean that you start having people come out to the surface, no longer be afraid to ask for help. And you could then have much more effective public health interventions for people who actually do have problematic drug use. And the truth is, other states have decriminalized personal use of drugs, like Portugal has. Some countries never criminalized in the first place, like Spain. And when Portugal decriminalized, you didn't see any significant increase in drug use. And instead, you saw a dramatic decrease in overdose and other negative consequences. They invested in the public health side, but the results have been pretty spectacular.
Well, hopefully we'll be learning how it affects Americans too, decriminalization. I want to thank Maria McFarland for talking to us. She is the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, and she's the author of the new book, There Are No Dead Here, A Story of Murder and Denial in Colombia. Maria, thanks for talking.
Thank you so much.
For Reason, I'm Nick Gillespie.